We've spent 4 weeks dealing with deep theology in terms of the Sabbath. Today I'm going to give you a little bit of a rest. I'm not going to go into deep theology this time and force you to think, but a little bit more laid back and easier sermon to grasp. We're going to be looking at lessons we can learn from kings. We're going to be looking 4 different weeks at 4 different kings and just what can we learn from their life. What can they teach us? Either what they did that was wonderful or perhaps what they didn't do that we should learn what not to do. And so today we're starting with the first king that Israel ever had, King Saul. The name Saul actually means asked for. So he was probably a child of parents who struggled to have children, who had to pray and ask for him, and then when he eventually was born, he was named asked for. So he must have been really special to his parents and perhaps a little bit spoiled. Of course, those of you who are second, third, and fourth children, you don't know what the word spoiled means. You always think the oldest one is spoiled, but in his case, probably just a little bit. He was from a wealthy family, so they had means to spoil him. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and his father had a whole bunch of donkeys. So one day the donkeys go missing. You know the story. His father sent him to go and get the donkeys. And went this way and that way and scour the whole land. I mean, it must have been many donkeys for him to be. He was gone for such a long time that his father was getting worried that something had happened to him. If it was just 1 or 2 donkeys, I'm sure he would have given up. But here he goes to the entire land, can't find his donkeys. But it does lead him to Samuel. And that's where he's anointed as king. You know, sometimes God does strange things with us. He uses annoyances, detours. He uses the unlikely to get us to where he wants us to be, to connect us with some place or some person where he wants us to serve. Sometimes the very things that irritate us and the very things that we consider to be bad news, things that don't work out right, in hindsight, end up being the very thing that God blesses us with and that God connects us where he wants us to be. So eventually then, he is appointed as king. Today we're going to be looking at the 4 things, the 4 big mistakes that Saul made. What can we learn and apply in our lives this week from the 4 mistakes that Saul made? Mistake number 1. The people of Ammon, strange people, go fighting against the people of Jabesh. And they capture them. So the people of Jabesh, the people of Ammon, well, we don't want to fight. We'll surrender. We'll be your slaves and we'll pay your taxes. Just leave us alone. No problem. So the king of Ammon, picture this, says to them, oh, that's okay. I'll accept your peace treaty on one condition. I want you all to line up in a big long row and come so that I can pierce out your right eye. Can you imagine that? Have a whole nation without a right eye? Poke everybody's right eye out, just as a sign and a symbol to irritate the rest of Israel. I wanted to humiliate you guys. So the people of Jabesh said, well, maybe this deal isn't so sweet anymore. Taxes, all right. Slavery, okay. Missing my right eye, I don't know. So I'll tell you what. We're going to give us a day or so, and we'll see if somebody's not willing to save us. And off they went, and eventually the story got to Saul. This newly appointed king, well, okay, I mean, that sure is a worthy cause, isn't it? So he wants to round up an army to go and save the people of Jabesh. And so this is what he says. Our first text today comes from 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 7. This is Saul. He took a pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent the pieces by messages throughout Israel proclaiming, this is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel. Then the terror, and the Hebrew word for terror here is literally dread, terror, fear, of the Lord fell on the people, and they turned out as one man. All of them showed up. Now here's the very first mistake that Saul makes, and you might be forgiven to think, oh, bad Saul, he shouldn't have done this, but we all do. We all fall into this trap. He uses fear as a means of motivating the people. What happened to the poor people that would have lost the right eye? Wouldn't it have been the best thing to say to the people, hey, our brothers over there are all going to lose the right eye? Their family. Don't you think we should rally up and go and defend them? But no, instead of using the proper reason, he uses fear. You don't come, I'll chop up your oxen. And if you don't have oxen, remember they didn't have tractors back then. If you didn't have oxen, you can't plow your lands. And if you can't plow your lands, next season you starve. Or you'll have to pay extremely high price to buy food from other people. Why use something negative? Why use fear to motivate them instead of the positive? We have brothers in trouble, let's rescue them. How many times as parents do we motivate our children using fear? Listen around you in the grocery store. If you don't stop whining right now, we're going home. If you don't do this, you can't go to the party. We use negative. We use negative consequences that quite often has nothing to do with the actual reason why we don't want them to do something. Or if we want them to do something. We often fall in this exact same mistake. Parents, be positive. Teach your kids to think. Use reason with them. Teach them the principle why you want them to do something or why you don't want them to do something. Don't be negative and threaten them with, the only reason they did it is because of fear and terror. What do you think is going to happen to their motivation when the terror disappears? Do they have any reason left to cooperate? No. So if you teach your child, the whole child's life, to not do things or to do things based upon fear, what do you think is going to happen the minute they step outside of your home and you're no longer there? The fear is gone. They have no reason to comply. They have not internalized any principle, any rule, or any logic or thinking as to when it's appropriate to do things and when it's not, because they've not been taught to think. They've not been given the reasons. Big mistake we all make. Let us be careful to not step into this trap. Don't use fear. It's a very strong motivator while it's there. But the minute it disappears, the motivation is gone. It just doesn't work. The second mistake that Saul made was a little disease we all suffer from, at least I do, called impatience. Want things to happen my way at my time. Want it to happen when I want it to happen. In fact, I think I suffer from this disease chronically. I have been known at college. My brother and I had this contract to drive cars up and down. Remember, we filled the cars with paying students. It was their cheapest way to get back home, and we made extra cash in the process. But I tell you, if we said we're leaving at 7 o'clock, we leave at 7 o'clock. We have been known to leave people behind because they were 10 minutes late. Come to think of it now as an adult, what difference does it make? We're on holiday. We didn't have any appointments or anything. But people were only late once when either my brother or I were driving. They learned to be on time. So I think I suffer also from this disease called impatience. I'll have to ask my family. They agree. Let's read his story of impatience. Chapter 13, verse 8. We're going to be reading quite a few verses here. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. So you have to understand here that they had an agreement. He didn't just wait 7 days before his patience ran out. He had an agreement. He spoke to Samuel, and Samuel told him, wait for me 7 days, then I'll come. So they had a fixed agreement here. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. In other words, he was late. He didn't come precisely on time. The 7 days expired, perhaps getting towards the end of the 7th day, and Samuel is nowhere in sight. So his people start to drift off, and he knows he's got a war to fight, and if all these people are not there to fight with him, he's going to lose the battle. So he gets impatient. Let's look what he does. Verse 9. So he said, Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offering. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Now, only the prophet Samuel was supposed to do this. Only Samuel was allowed to do this. He got impatient, took matters in his own hands, and started doing what was unlawful for him to do. You see, we often think that when someone's late, they deserve to be punished. Or we often think that when some deadline expires, the consequences go. I was on my way to Monterey Bay Academy one day when a very stern-faced and unfriendly policeman pulled me over. I knew why. I was impatient. And I was in a hurry. Number one. Number two, I've been here 10 years and I can't get used to the speed limits. They're so slow. In South Africa, we get to travel 75 miles on any road, unless it's in town. This particular road, right that long stretch as you get out of Watsonville, just the previous week they marked it down to 40 miles an hour. I didn't know. I was used to traveling 55 on the road. So this stern-faced cop says to me, "You're driving too fast." And I say to him, "You going to give me a ticket for 3 miles?" Because he mentioned I traveled 58 miles. 55, 58, you're going to give me a ticket for 3 miles? He says, "No, you don't understand. It was changed last week to 40 on this road. You went 18 miles too fast." He gave me a big ticket. At the bottom of the ticket, it said, you either have to pay or there's a court date you have to appear in court. Now, I have never received a ticket, ever. I didn't know what to do with the thing. Where do I pay it? What do I know? I'm a foreigner, right? So I asked this guy, "Well, where do I pay this? What do I do? I've never received a ticket before." In the back of my mind, I was hoping that when he heard I never got a ticket before, well, perhaps he'll give me off, you see, but that didn't work either. So he says to me, "Well, just wait. You'll receive some information through the mail, and when you do, you just follow the instructions." So I sat and waited, and I waited, and I waited. And just like Saul, where Samuel and Saul agreed upon a certain time, and Samuel didn't quite come on time, the same thing happened to me. I thought that this document was a legal document, and it said that there's a date, and on that date I need to be in court or pay. Well, that date came and went, and nothing came through the mail. So I thought they'd forgotten about me. I'm off. I wouldn't have to pay. Because after all, I have a legal document that says by this date, and it didn't happen. I learned later on, it doesn't quite work that way. Not only did I have to pay the fine, but I had to spend 3 hours on online traffic school, and then pass their exam afterwards as well. Because something happens late doesn't mean the consequences go by the wayside. Because their letter on when and where I was supposed to pay, or whatever the real court date was, came late after their date, doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Because Samuel didn't quite come when Saul expected him to come doesn't mean that he's not coming. And we often just take matters in our own hands and decide to do what we want to do when someone's late. We get impatient. Now, you may be forgiven for being late with people. Or you may be forgiven for taking things in your own hands when people are late. But when God is late, according to your estimation, what then? Is it possible for God to be late? You see, God can do anything. He can reverse anything. He can do miracles. We often want to take things in our own hands when we think God is late. When we think God should have already showed up and He didn't. And then we still get angry at God. But God, you knew I had this deadline. I needed to have the money by this date. Or I needed to be healed or whatever. And it doesn't happen, and then we get angry at God. Where have you been, Lord? I've been praying earnestly. I've had the whole church pray for me. Where have you been? The mistake that Saul made was when God's servant didn't show up on time, he decided to take his place. He decided to make the offering and the sacrifice. The lesson we have to learn is we need to let God be God. We can't take his place. The second lesson we need to learn from this incident is God's timing is not our timing. God's timing will never be our timing. Let's look at verse 10. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived. Now, you'll notice from the agreement, which is recorded twice in the book of Samuel, when they actually made the agreement, and then here when we read after 7 days, you'll notice that the agreement they had was that Samuel would come after 7 days. There was no agreement that said he'll come on 12 o'clock on the 7th day, or 4 o'clock on the 7th day. It was just the day. So was Samuel late? He wasn't really late at all. He came the same day as what he promised to come. He just came later than what Saul wanted him to come. He got impatient. I hate to break the news to you if you don't know it already. God loves doing this. In fact, this is how God works. I was taught that when you have an important appointment, you need to leave to be there a half an hour before the time. So if you get a flat tire or traffic or whatever, you're still on time. If you operate that with God, just know you're going to wait a half an hour. Because God never shows up early. There's not a single story anywhere in Scripture where somebody has a need where God shows up early and answers the prayer a long time before it's needed. God doesn't work that way. Verse 11. What have you done? Asked Samuel. Saul replied, when I saw that men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time. Oh, that's not quite true. You came on the set time. And that the Philistines were assembling at Machmesh. Oh boy, the actual reasons he got scared. He got scared that God would not answer, that Samuel wouldn't come. So not only does he rule others by fear, he makes decisions himself based on his fears. Verse 12. What have you done? Asked. Yeah, there we go. I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. The Hebrew here says, I forced myself to do it. Didn't really want to do it, but I forced myself to do it. I just was compelled. So I just had to do what I had to do. I mean, after all, you were late. It's your fault, actually. God doesn't come with lots of time to spare. God always operates in the nick of time. Think of your own life. Don't believe me? God waited until the food in the ark was depleted before he made the ark come to rest. He waited until Isaac was tied on the altar with Abraham's hand and knife raised on high before he provided the ram. He waited for the Egyptians to be right on the tails of the Israelites before he opened the Red Sea. They'd already panicked. He waited until they ran out of food before he provided the manna. He waited until they had no water to drink before he made it gush out of a rock. He waited until Daniel was inside the lion's den before he announced to the lions they're on an extended fast. He waited until lion's 3 friends were already inside the fiery furnace before he rescued them so they wouldn't burn. God doesn't prevent them from going into the lion's den. He doesn't prevent them from going into the fiery furnace. He doesn't prevent them from being thirsty or hungry or tired on the altar. He waits until you're already there, when you really have to have faith before he acts. There's hundreds of these examples. God waited for Esther to be in the king's chambers unlawfully and facing death before he softened the king's heart. He waited on the very day when the people of Shushan were to execute all the Jews before he saved them. He waited until little boy David went out and actually faced giant Goliath before God saved him. All the Israelites back there were praying for Goliath to get a heart attack or God to send beasts to sting him or whatever, but he waits until crisis, when real faith is required before he acts. That's just how God works. He waited until the woman's food was totally exhausted. Her very last few crumbles of meal for the prophet's food was exhausted before he multiplies it. Oh, and by the way, he doesn't fill the canister. New faith is required every day as she uses up what is in there. He waited until the woman's kids were about to be sold into slavery to pay her debt, when there was no hope or any time left, before he multiplied her oil that she could sell to pay the debt. God waits until faith is required. God waited for Joseph to be sold as a slave and in prison before he rescued him. Even in the New Testament, Jesus waits for Lazarus to be dead, thoroughly dead if such a thing exists, for how many? 4 days before he resurrects him. That's just how God operates. Because he wants you to demonstrate your faith. If God answered all of these prayers long before the deadline, they wouldn't have needed faith. A lesson which Saul didn't learn. A lesson that we need to learn today. God never shows up too early. God cannot be late, but he will always wait until the nick of time at the very end. Don't be impatient with God. Let God be God. Let him figure out when it's most appropriate for him to show up and do what he does best. The third mistake that Saul made was that he took praise for that which God had done. Let's read our next verse. Chapter 15, verse 12. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul. But he was told Saul was gone to Carmel. Where was he? Where did he go and what for? There he has set up a monument in whose honor? In his own honor, and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. You see what this guy does? The Lord gives him victory, so he builds this monument in his honor. Look what I have done. But meantime, God was the one that did it. How often do we take the glory for what other people do or for what God does? Why do you think the biblical authors, especially in the Old Testament, go out of their way to demonstrate that there's no human way possible? That if there's deliverance from this issue, it can only be as a result of God. The reason is so that they can't turn around afterwards and say, I did it. Why do you think God said to Gideon, you have too many men? I want you to go with all those. The Bible tells us why. So that you can't say it's you and your army who did it. Go with 300. There are thousands. So that there's no human way in which you can claim honor for what has happened. God is the one who earns the glory. He's the one that should get the glory. We ought to be very careful to take glory what God has done. If you have a talent God has given you, do you give God the glory for that? If you do something well, do you give God the glory? we ought to be very careful that we give glory to God and not heap it upon ourselves. Jesus addressed this issue in the New Testament. Jesus says, if you have already received the praise of men, don't expect to get it a second time from God. You choose who you want to receive praise from, people or God. The fourth and last mistake that Saul made was a big mistake that we sometimes share with Saul. A mistake that has shred churches to pieces. A mistake that has ruined families. A mistake that has ruined marriages. And that is, he focused on David as his enemy, when instead he had all these other nations to contend with all the time. It's ridiculous. It's laughable if you see what's actually going on. The Bible tells us that Saul had war his entire reign. Saul does not have peace at any time. He's barely finished fighting this nation, then it's the Philistines, then it's the Ammonites, then it's the Amalekites. He's got all these nations attacking him all the time. And what does he do? He's running after David. Trying to kill David. One man. And later David's got a band of 300 people. I mean, get serious. You're fighting nations, and if you read the statistics, these guys came at them with 6,000 iron chariots, so many thousands of horses, and many, many, many more thousands of soldiers, and you running after David? Who's the enemy here? Has David ever done anything to demonstrate to you that he's going to kill you, that he's a threat to you or anything? I forgot. He was jealous. Because David was more a successful warrior than what he was. David killed Goliath when Saul was the one who was supposed to face Goliath. Why do I know that? Well, why was Saul chosen to begin with? Any idea? Why did the people want Saul? Saul was actually appointed king twice. Once by Samuel and once by the people. What was the people's reason for wanting Saul? The Bible says that twice. He was head and shoulders taller than anybody else. So when a giant comes facing them, who do you think is best equipped to deal with a giant? But no. Boy David, a teenager, kills the giant. Big knock on his ego. And in subsequent battles, David just is more successful on the battlefield than Saul. So he's jealous. He would rather satisfy and get rid of the problem of his jealousy than to get rid of the problem that could extinguish the entire nation. Let's read it together. I'm going to read two texts. 1 Samuel 14, verse 47. After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side. Moab, Ammonites, Edom, king of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. And might I add, vice versa. He had a bunch of serious enemies, and they were pretty mad at him throughout his reign. But look what he does. 1 Samuel 18, verse 29. Saul became still more afraid of, the him here is David, and he remained his enemy for the rest of his days. Now, to us it seems, hello, what are you thinking? You're chasing this lone man with 300 men. What can he really do? How big of a threat is he? When you have all these other serious enemies, your entire reign, exhausting the country, and you're chasing after David? What's the matter with you? And we think that this is a Saul problem, but actually, it's not. Every one of us do this from time to time. We go after the guy that works with us, does a wonderful job, because that person works better than what I do. No different from these two. Or perhaps We ill-treat somebody in church because they sing better than what I can. That's all of you, by the way. I don't sing well. Or we're furious because he got picked to be elder and I didn't. Or whatever other situation there may be. Who's the real enemy? What are the real issues? Are we battling against flesh and blood, our own people, or are we battling against Satan? What is most important? I have seen churches being ripped up because they can't agree on what color carpet to install. I've seen churches being ripped up because one doesn't like the other one's music. And I'm not talking about inappropriate music that you should take a stand on. I'm just talking about taste. I've seen families broken because the one wanted to roll up very neatly the toothpaste tube when it was still metal, and the other one squished it. And then the person who wants it rolled up gets all frustrated and has to sit there and get all the wrinkles out and start rolling it up again. And then when it's time to brush teeth again, squish. Yes, we suffer from the same thing. We focus on nonsense. We fight over nonsense. Instead of focusing on that which really matters and those who are really the enemy. Luckily, we don't have this in this church. We have a wonderful church. We don't do that. But as individuals, this is a trap that we can all fall into simply because of jealousy. Let us use our resources and energy on that which makes a difference in life rather than to use it on junk, on stuff that's irrelevant. I have seen both individuals and church people who have used a rusted, broken hatchet that should have been rather put in a museum. But no, they're still using it to chop each other to bits. Issues that grandfathers used to fight, grandchildren are still continuing to fight. Issues that are totally irrelevant and not an issue at all, but either side refuses to budge. And so the only reason this is continuing is because they don't want to be humiliated, to give in. Same problem Saul had. I don't know about you, but I'm very busy. And I know many of you are very busy. I'm in a tight budget. I don't have money laying around that I wonder what I can do with. And I'm sure that all of you are in the same boat. The economy stuff. Why should we waste our limited time, our limited financial resources, fighting junk, arguing over nonsense? Praise the Lord, we haven't had that here. But I've certainly seen it work wherever I've gone. We need to learn this lesson. Praise other people when they do well. Don't be jealous. We're on the same team. Why would I be mad when I play a soccer game that one of my teammates scored a goal? Why should that make me mad? We're on the same team. That goal is making me win as much as that guy's winning. These two were on the same team. But they kept on fighting. How many times have we deemed someone else an enemy simply because they do something better than we do? That's like me being mad at Dick and Charlotte because they sing better than what I do. It doesn't make sense. That's like me being mad at Dr. Oler because he preaches better than what I do. It doesn't make sense. We're on the same team. How many times have we refused to bury that hatchet for whatever reason? Let us learn these 4 lessons from the life of Saul today, which ended tragically. And the people had to pay a heavy price for his mistakes. We don't have to go through the same mistakes. Let us learn from others. Number 1, let's not use fear when we motivate other people, especially our children. Number 2, let God be God. His timing is not our timing. His timing will never be our timing. That's how God works. Number 3, give praise and credit to God where it's due. Don't claim credit for yourself when it's something God did. And number 4, correctly identify and resist the real enemy. Don't waste your time. Don't waste your money. Don't waste your energy on things that makes no difference. Let's focus on that which does. Amen.